Our first reading from the Bible today comes from Paul's letter to the church at Rome. And so I'm reading from Romans chapter 8, verses 12 to 25. So then, brothers and sisters, we are debtors, not to the flesh, to live according to the flesh. For if you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live. For all who are led by the Spirit of God are children of God. For you did not receive a spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you have received a spirit of adoption. When we cry, Abba, Father, it is that very Spirit bearing witness with our spirit that we are children of God. And if children, then heirs, heirs of God, and joint heirs with Christ. If, in fact, we suffer with him so that we may also be glorified with him. I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory about to be revealed to us. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the children of God. For the creation was subjected to fertility, not of its own will, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay and will obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning in labour pains until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly while we wait for adoption, the redemption of our bodies. For in hope we were saved. Now hope that is seen is not hope, for who hopes for what is seen? But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience. And our gospel reading today comes from Matthew's Gospel. It's a parable within a series of parables that Jesus told. So it's Matthew chapter 13, verses 24 to 30. He put before them another parable. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to someone who sowed good seed in his field. But while everybody was asleep, an enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat, and then went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared as well. And the slaves of the household came and said to him, Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? Where then did these weeds come from? He answered, An enemy has done this. The slaves said to him, Then do you want us to go and gather them? But he replied, No, for in gathering the weeds you would uproot the wheat along with them. Let both of them grow together until the harvest. And at harvest time I will tell the reapers, Collect the weeds first, and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn. Lord, may your word live within us.
We've just heard a story or a parable about wheat and weeds. I'd like to tell you another parallel story from Andrew Greeley. Once upon a time, there was an 8th grade church football team that inherited a tradition of losing almost all the games of the season. The other teams were supported by their parishes with uniforms, coaching staff, after-school training. But the kids from St Useless didn't have a coach or uniforms or much parental support. They were talented, but they were untrained. Then one day, a young man came up and watched them stumble through practice. "Can I help?" he asked them. Well, the team was ready to accept help from anyone. "You fellas really are the best," he said to them. "You know, there's no reason that you can't win the premiership, but you have to practice. You have to be confident in yourselves, and above all, you need to be good friends. No more fighting among the team or with me if I'm going to be your unofficial coach." Well, the kids agreed. And the first thing that the coach taught them was how to be friends and how to play together with one another. And he told them training session after training session just how good they were. Finally, he made them work at what they were doing. And you know what happened? They went on to become undefeated and won the premiership. "He made us believe in ourselves," one of the kids said. The next year, the parents hired a real coach, and the team finished last on the ladder. If we believe that this football story or this parable that we heard of the weeds and wheat by Jesus are to be spiritualised, that is, to be seen as earthly stories with heavenly meanings, we won't be alone. Much of the church treats parables that way, as earthly stories with heavenly meanings. Simple stories with trite meanings that are plotted out for us, often lifted out of their social or historical context and reshaped into a either theological or moral fable, bereft of any political or economic edge or consequence. We don't want politics and religion mixing together, and so we take the parable out of that context and just moralise it about our own lives. It's a sad thing, because that's actually not what parables are about. Brandon Scott, a founding member of the Jesus Seminar and a student of the study of the parables, says, "The parables give us access to the way Jesus reimagined the possibility of living, of being in the world. They are not just religious, not just about God. They are multifaceted reimaginings of life, reimaginings of the possibilities of life." In other words, Matthew's understanding of Jesus' purpose was to get his hearers to see the world differently. And that can be summed up in this phrase: God's reign is not an otherworldly proposition. God's reign is precisely about this world and the way we live now. It is said by many that the world is now so different since the 11th of September and since last Friday with the downing of that airliner. And I'm sure it is. One of those differences is the great polarity that now exists between differing people throughout the world, between Christian and Muslim and Jew and Muslim and Hindu and Muslim and us and them and black and white, and the way in which we want to divide everyone up into little camps. The daily news of suspected terrorist attacks, the enemy takes hope away and tries to convince us that human cleverness, spying on the enemy, having the smartest weapons, living in constant suspicion of strangers, that all of that will save us. Right now does not seem to be a good time for hope, for reason, for patience. right now does not seem to be a good time to allow both wheat, the good guys, and the weeds, the bad guys, from growing together. For in our world today, one is seen as having worth and the other completely useless. Bill Loader comments on this, and what he says is quite telling. A sense that there is an enemy marks many societies, religious and otherwise. It's almost as if we need an enemy, an other against whom we can define ourselves. This need will sometimes sustain images of enemies, even create enemies for our survival. A mild paranoia keeps some people going and gives their life meaning. Life makes sense when there's a them and an us. The simpler, the better. This is the stuff of prejudice, and religion is often exploited to hold those prejudices in place. The Jesus of Matthew, in telling this parable, suggests another way. But with our tendency to domesticate parables, we can give Matthew's point and circumstance less attention than it deserves. So what was going on in Matthew's day around which this parable would have significance? Quite possibly the division in the Syrian synagogue between those Jews who seek to follow the way of Jesus and those who don't. This division is what Matthew's point of the story is. And he says, don't weed, deal inclusively. Let the weeds and the wheat grow together. For if you pull out the weeds while the wheat's growing, you're going to destroy the wheat as well. And it's interesting to think about this weeds and wheats growing together, side by side. And at harvest, they're separated out. And some are bundled up to be burned and others are sent. Now, the other thing here to recognise is this isn't about who's in and who's out, because both had a great use in Jesus' day. You gathered together the weeds, bound them together into little bundles, and they were your fire starters. You needed them to create your little fire. You didn't have little life lighters like we've got or other little things you could use. You used little bundles of dried up weeds that would start your fire. And you used the wheat as well. It's not saying one is bad and one is good. They both have a use. But to pull one out while the other's growing could destroy them both. Allow them to grow together, then they can be separated afterwards, and both are important and useful. It's interesting because so often these parables are used to define who's in and who's out. But the reality is that it's in the midst of the mess of coexistence of all these different peoples together that God is revealed. Not in some hypothetical situation where good seed or fair dinkum people or real Christians, usually the champions of the right, grow in pure isolation. It actually says they all grow in there together and all of them will have a role. This doesn't mean that there won't be conflict or difficulties, but it does mean that where there is conflict and difficulties, never cease to act graciously or to have compassion. Never write people off. Never uproot people in your mind or your attitudes by treating them as no longer of any worth, which I have to admit in reality can sometimes be quite difficult. David Ranson is an Australian Catholic priest, and an article in the publication Eremus on reconciliation, he records a comment by the Buddhist Dalai Lama. When he asked, did he hate the Chinese, the Dalai Lama said no. He remarked, the Chinese were indeed dominant, and he had no possibility of overthrowing them by might. Were he to hate them, therefore no change would occur in the Chinese. But change would certainly occur within him. His own heart would become more tense, more bitter and rigid. The only way forward then was to let go of hateful feelings that might arise, and in the space that ensued, perhaps there was a greater possibility for peace. Some would say these parables are nothing but earthly stories with heavenly meanings. Well, I would say no way. These are earthly stories with quite heavy meanings. Meanings that are meant to stir us and to change us. To not just take the tried answer, but to look deeper at what they say to us in our context today. We live in a world that in many ways wants to tear itself apart. What might this parable be saying to us today?